Alright, parts of the sliding compound miter saw. Handle, trigger. We have the guard, which are self-retracting. We have the slide, which I can lock out with the bottle cap shaped piece. We have the slide lock, which that is. We have the compound miter lock or compound angle lock. We have the miter angle adjustment and lock. Adjustable fences. So we're looking at the sliding compound miter saw today. Miter saw is a tool used to mostly do dimensional lumber. It's used for cross-cutting. Cross-cutting implies that I'm going to cut across the grain of a piece of wood, as opposed to a ripping cut which moves with the grain of the wood. Miter saws are also referred to as chop saws due to the chopping motion. So if I'm using this machine, you can see it's very similar to a chopping motion of an axe. Hence why if you hear the expression chop saw, they're referring to a miter saw. This action is a miter saw. This is a compound miter saw, which means I can set miter angles for doing things like picture frames. But it's also a compound miter saw, which means I can also set a bevel angle to create very complicated cuts, such as crown moldings or leaning details like dental molding or something like that. So when you come to use a miter saw, it's important that you make sure that you have set your settings back to 0 so that you know your piece of wood is going to be cut square. When you're going to use a miter saw, first thing you should be aware of is if you come to the miter saw and it's sitting like this is a normal setup for it just to be in storage. There is a silver pin directly underneath the motor, and if I need to unlock the machine, I can simply push down on the handle, pull the silver pin out, and that will unlock the miter saw for use. As I've already stated, miter saws are meant for cross-cutting. Never attempt to do a ripping cut. This is a very dangerous setup and can potentially cause kickback and injury. When you first come to use it, check to make sure your miter angle is at 0, and it's a good idea to make sure that your compound angle or your bevel angle is also at 0. I can tighten this handle to make it so it doesn't want to change the bevel angle at all. When I first come to it, again, things to check. I want to make sure that the guard moves freely. It doesn't happen very often, but every so often you can have a chunk of wood jump up inside the guard and jam it in place, and then the guard will either leave you exposed to a blade that's turning, or it can jam up and block it so that your guard will not move, and therefore the miter saw will not come down in motion. If this happens, it probably means that there's a problem inside the guard where a piece of wood has gotten stuck inside. When you go to make a cut, make sure, notice my hand is not inside the trigger area, make sure that I'm not in an area where my fences are going to be cut during the cut. Just safe habits of practice, make sure you always do your cuts first. If I'm going to be working with smaller pieces, I want to make sure the push stick for the miter saw is close by, so that if I need to make a cut inside an area that is too dangerous to hold barehanded, I can use my push stick to hold outside of my danger area, but still have a steady hold against the fence. This is a good setup for doing small cuts and will keep your hands in a safe position. General safety. As always, we talk about the 3 P's. You should obtain permission before getting onto a machine. You should always make sure you're wearing eye protection, and you should make sure you take care of personal protection. Personal protection can be different for each machine. In the case of a miter saw, my danger is all in the front. I shouldn't be moving very much when I'm using the miter saw, so I want to make sure my front area is protected. I will tuck in anything loose. I will make sure I have no loose sleeves near the machine. I will make sure I will have hair tied back if I have long hair. Hoodie strings I should have tucked in. And if I cannot deal with these items by tucking them in or removing them, then I will apply an apron over the entire front of me to hold everything away from the machine. So personal protection is always the most dynamic. It can change depending on which machine you have, but you always want to make sure that you protect yourself from potentially getting caught on the material being fed in the machine or moving parts of the machine. If I'm going to be cutting a piece of wood, I want to make sure that I have my piece of wood touching the bed of the machine and the fence of the machine at the position I'm actually going to be cutting at. This item could do a complete circle around me if I needed it to, but it must touch the bed and the fence in the position I'm going to cut. If I don't do this, as I make my cut, the board would get pushed in, closing the space the blade has made, pinching onto the blade. That blade that is spinning now, because it cannot go deeper into the material, will be forced to come back at me. This is why we refer to it as a kickback. In the case of the miter saw, the handle and the blade will kick back towards you rather than the piece of work. So it's important that we always make sure we have tight to the table, tight to the fence to prevent the chances of kickback. To help prevent that farther, I step to the side to make sure I'm out of the path of the machine in case of kickback. If I were to stand here and operate it, if this machine were to kick back now, the handle can potentially come back and hit me in the face. By taking one step to the side, I can see clearly where I'm cutting, the material I'm cutting, the blade cutting it, and I am out of the path of the machine. If I stand here, I can see nothing other than the top of the guard and the top of the machine. I actually can't even see where the cut is occurring. So this is actually not only a dangerous spot, but a bad spot visually for me to be able to do this cut safely. By stepping to the side, I remove the chances of getting punched in the face by my own hand, and I can see the cut area where I'm actually working. Again, this is for doing cross cuts. Never attempt to do a ripping cut where the chances of kickback are huge. So when you're setting up, make sure your hand is at least a hand distance away from the blade. So if I was working with this machine, I would make sure I was at least that far away holding my work. If my piece is smaller than this, that is where I would use the small push stick to hold that piece closer, but keep my hand farther away. Again, anytime I come to the machine, I want to make sure I have my 0 and my 0 double checked to make sure I am going to get an actual square cut. If I need to use the slide, I will unlock the slide with this bottle cap shaped lock, pull it out, and I will start the cut from the outside and work inwards. This way I am pushing against the direction of kickback. That way, if the machine tries to kick back, my muscles are already working against it to prevent that. As opposed to starting at the inside and pulling out, where if it causes kickback, I am actually helping it kick back towards me. By the time I tell my muscles to reverse direction, it will be too late. So whenever I'm working with a slide, I will start at the outside of the cut and then push inwards to help prevent any chances of kickback. If I don't need this slide though, I will lock the slide out, again with the bottle cap lock here, and that way the chances of it jumping back towards me are again reduced. If I don't need it, lock it out so that it won't want to kick back at me. Okay, safety glasses on, 3 P's observed. I am going to make a cut on this material. So I would have a mark on my wood. As always with the wood shop, I will line up a mark here using a pencil, not a pen. This is where I will put my face in line with the mark. I will keep my hand outside of the trigger area. So I will place my hand flat on top of the handle so there's no chance I'm going to accidentally pull the trigger while I'm lining up. Now I can line up with the edge of the blade by looking through the slots in my guard to line up my cut. Once I've got it lined up, I will bring the machine away from the material. I will make sure my hand is at least a hand distance away from the place I'm cutting. Then I will let the machine come to full speed before completing my cut. Again, I want to make sure I'm tight to the bed, tight to the fence to try and prevent kickback. If I hear the blade starting to slow down and I know a kickback is about to happen, I will pull out of the cut, push harder towards the fence, and attempt the cut again. That way, hopefully, I can re-widen the slot and complete the cut without kickback. As you can see, miter saws do a very nice clean end grain cut. We have a very good blade on it, and this will help get a square quality cut without having to do a whole lot of special setups. One of the advantages of the miter saw is it is set up to do cross cutting all the time. In the case of doing a piece that is wider, I will do a cut with the slide. So I'm going to unlock the slide. Now I will repeat the procedure. I will let it come to full speed, pull it to the end of the slide, push down and push back in, so I'm always working against the direction of the kickback. I will put it in the position to give me the flat contact against the bed and the flat contact against the fence. In this case, I'm going to attempt to remove this cracked piece. Again, I'm going to make sure I am at least a hand distance away holding it. And I will go through the process, starting with full speed, coming to the outside and pushing back towards the fence. As I was making the cut, I could hear the blade starting to slow down. And I knew that meant, probably because of this difficult grain here, that the piece of wood had actually started to close in the gap like that. Once I heard that, I pulled the blade out and started the cut fresh again, widening this gap back out so that it was no longer going to pinch my blade. In the case of thick and wide material, you may need to do that 2, 3, 4 times even to manage to get through an entire cut if the grain is difficult and moving while you're cutting it. But as long as you have put it tight to the bed and tight to the fence, you're not going to have it kicking back from the board physically moving itself, but rather the wood moving as you're cutting it. Alright, let's look at some special setups then. I've cut a narrow piece and a wide piece. Once I'm done, I will lock out the slide. For my special setups, I'm going to look at cutting small pieces. So let's say for a moment that I want to cut something that is smaller than it is safe for me to hold. For example, if I wanted to cut this, as you can see on our machine, it actually has a line to tell you how far away you should be. I am clearly within that danger zone here. There is no way I should be able to hold that piece safely and keep my hand outside of that area. This is where this push stick comes in. In the case of a wider piece like this, I will find an extra piece to mimic that, so that when I'm holding this piece now, my push stick is flat to the piece of wood that I'm using. If I don't do that, it cuts down the amount of area that my push stick is effective. Now if I cut this, it can pivot like that, and this is rather dangerous for us to make a cut. By putting a piece like this, I can place the push stick in here. This gives me plenty of contact area. That piece is now held tight to the fence. My hand is outside of the danger area, and I can complete this cut. As you can see, I cut as normal. My hand is outside of the danger area. Even though my piece is too small for my hand to hold it normally, the push stick has taken care of that. For pieces that I need to do repeated cuts over and over again, possibly doing something like a building construction project where all my studs are exactly the same length, or a furniture project where my legs for my table should all be the same length, or doing a jewelry box where I need my sides to be exactly the same, I would use a stop block. And in many cases, a stop block is nothing more than a scrap of wood that I have clamped onto my fence. So I can take a regular clamp and clamp this on here, and then my piece will have the same distance of cut every time I make that cut. So if I wanted to cut many pieces all exactly the same, I can put this in here, make this cut, switch to the next piece, put it in, make that cut. One of the dangers in this is if you rush too much, this tends to happen, where they pound against the stop block too quickly and it moves the stop block and your pieces get longer and longer. So when you're using a stop block, gently place it in position to keep from moving your stop block. As before, I want to make sure I am controlling the piece of wood. So I want to have a stop block in place. I must control the piece between the blade and the stop block. I need to do that because if this moves at all, it becomes longer than this space and therefore wedges itself against the blade and causes kickback. This piece has nothing wedging it and it can move away freely. So I must always control the piece between the blade and the stop block when I'm doing cuts with a stop block. If I'm doing very small accurate cuts, then I should use a setup of a zero clearance fence. In which case, I will take a small scrap of material, I can cut it, and then I would clamp this piece up onto my fence like this, with a clamp here and here, so that when I'm making cuts where I need it to be extremely accurate, there is nowhere for this wood to chip away at the end now. I would clamp these two pieces onto the fence, and this would give me a nice clean cut with zero chip out. It's also a very good idea if I'm working with small pieces to do this, to prevent the piece from pivoting around the end of the fence. By having a zero clearance fence like this, now there is nowhere for it to pivot. So this is a good setup for extremely accurate cuts and very small cuts. So here we'll do the stop block. I'm going to put my piece of wood gently against the stop block so that I don't move my stop block every time I come against it. This is actually too small an area for my hand, so I will put a scrap back here and hold this piece with my push stick. Now that is held safely in place, my hand is safely out of the way, and I have the stop block for repeated cuts. I must control the piece between the blade and the stop block. As long as I have this stop block set, I should be able to do pieces cut all exactly the same length. For doing very precise and accurate cuts, I have a zero clearance fence set up now. This will allow me to get right in here and do a very accurate cut without it pivoting into the fence or without it causing chip back on the back side of the grain. Again, because this is smaller than it's safe for me to hold by hand, I'm using my push stick, and I will cut a zero clearance cut. As you can see, virtually no tear out on the end of the grain. It's a nice square cut, as opposed to cuts that I've done without this, where I have quite a bit of tear out on the grain. This is fine for construction, building houses. This is what you want to see more for building furniture and trim in a house. So a zero clearance fence, when you're cutting very precise, accurate pieces, is a good setup. That piece I will get rid of.